Welcome to our event this evening. My name is Sherry Kling, and I'm Director of Process and Faith. And we're very excited to be able to share this wonderful event with you this evening. Let me just click on that. Okay. And yeah, so we just want to welcome you to this event, which is called From Amipotence to All-Encompassing Mercy, Integrating Oord's Theology of Love into the Islamic Tradition. And our speaker this evening is Duderija, who is an associate professor in the study of Islam and society at Griffith University in Brisbane, Queensland, Australia. And he's been publishing for almost 2 decades on various aspects of the Islamic intellectual tradition, especially progressive Islam. And so we love being in dialogue with different traditions in process and faith. We are, after all, a multi-faith network of relational spirituality. And I will say we have other events that will be coming up now and going forward. So if you want to go to our website and subscribe for our newsletter or join our community as a free member, you can do that and you'll hear about everything that's happening. And this event is being recorded, and we will everybody who's registered will get a link to that recording as well. So with no further ado, let me welcome Professor Duderija. Good to see you, Otis.
Oh, good morning, evening, good afternoon, wherever you happen to be. It's a real pleasure to be here with you. Many thanks to Sherry and the leadership of Process and Faith for giving me this opportunity to talk to you about the challenges and opportunities of integrating omnipotence, a concept coined by one of the leading open and relational theologians who happens to be present with us today, just to intimidate me, I think, on purpose, but I'll forgive him for that. Yeah. So my talk is titled Embracing Omnipotence, Redefining Divine Love in the Islamic Tradition. I'm going to start us off with a nice quote, which will hopefully set the scene. It comes from a 13th century Persian Islamic mystic, Fariduddin al-Attar. And I will talk about him in more detail in the last segment of my talk today, but I felt that this nice quote from him would be a good way to kind of start off this conversation, because in his writings, I wouldn't use the word theology because he's more of a mystic. In his spirituality, I'm going to be exploring the affinities between his way of approaching spirituality and the divine, and I'll just use the word Tom. Forgive me if I am too casual. Professor Oord sounds a bit too formal, given that we are not in an academic context, and Tom's concept of omnipotence. So, but before I do that, I'm going to, so the focus will be, thank you, Tom. I do need to talk about, and if I could have the next slide, please. I will talk about also the challenges and the obstacles in mainstream Islamic theology in terms of integrating the concept of omnipotence as conceptualized and discussed by Tom in his most recently in his The Depth of Omnipotence and the Birth of Amipotence. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing this correctly. Yeah, so I also had the pleasure of contributing a chapter as a response to Tom's book on omnipotence. My talk in part is relies on that essay, but I have brought in some new material as well, especially material from Attar's ideas and how they intersect and and how they can be used as a fertile theological spiritual resource in integrating the concept of omnipotence into the Islamic theology. So from now on, I'm going to um, read from my notes. It shouldn't take more than 20 to 25 minutes. Hopefully the slides will be help you in terms of keeping up with the content, and I look forward to having a really constructive, fruitful discussion with you afterwards. So in my talk, as I mentioned earlier on, I want to talk about the challenges and the obstacles, the challenges associated with integrating omnipotence into the Islamic tradition. The Islamic tradition, rooted in the notions of God's omnipotence and sovereignty, often stands in stark contrast to the relational love of God emphasized by omnipotence as conceptualized and discussed by Oord. However, I will argue through reinterpretation of Quranic attributes and with the insights of notable Sufi Islamic mystic Fariduddin Attar, who was a 13th century Persian poet philosopher, we can uncover a rich depository of Islamic thought that not only challenges conventional beliefs about the divine, as encapsulated by the classical theistic concept of God that has dominated Islamic theology for centuries, much like Christian theology, but also open pathways for a more compassionate and relational understanding of the divine. So by engaging in these ideas, I aim to highlight the potential for an omnipotent-oriented theology in Islam that prioritizes love and mercy as the most essential attributes of the divine. But before I do that, a reminder of a little bit a summary of Oord's definition and the discussion of omnipotence is in order. So Oord defines omnipotence in the following manner, and I quote, "We best define the love in omnipotence as acting intentionally in relational response to God and others to promote overall well-being. This definition applies to both divine and creaturely love. The love God and creatures express, in other words, acts with intention, relates with others, and aims to promote flourishing. And because love is inherently uncontrolling, neither divine nor creaturely love controls. Love can't be omnipotent." End of quote. This comes from Tom's book, The Death of Omnipotence and Birth of Amipotence, page 122. In the same book, Oord goes on to argue that while this concept and definition of love applies to both God and humanity, the degree and nature of God's love is infinitely greater. Divine love is universal in scope as only God's presence spans all of creation, since only God is omnipresent. God's love also differs in duration as it exists eternally without beginning or end. The frequency of God's love also differs from human as it is constant and unwavering, since only God is everlasting. Additionally, God's love for Oord also differs in adequacy because, as the all-knowing one, in the open and relational sense of that word, God's understanding of what truly promotes well-being is perfect and complete. With God's omniscience, in an open and relational sense of the term, comes a superior ability to love in a way that accounts for all the factors affecting prosperity and fulfillment, both temporarily and spiritually. The true sense of God's omnipotence, therefore, for Oord, relates to the immense influence and potency of the divine influence over all of creation. God's power vastly surpasses any power that human or other creatures possess. This is partly because an omnipresent God has the ability to affect all beings everywhere simultaneously. But the power of God's love especially makes it supreme because divine love is relentless and enduring. It exists forever without cessation. God's omnipotent power is both active and receptive. It is empowering while also empathetic. The influence of omnipotence wooingly draws beings near, yet remains patient and uncontrolling in nature. Hopefully, I have done justice to Tom's conceptualization of omnipotence. Now, I find myself in complete agreement with Oord's explanation and justification underpinning omnipotence. And now I would like to talk about some major obstacles in the Islamic tradition of integrating omnipotence into Islamic theology. So if we could have the next slide, please. Oh, sorry, I should have said this earlier on. Next slide, please. All right. So, like in mainstream Christian theology, the concept of God in Islamic orthodoxy is a byproduct of what the late Professor Charles Hartshorne has described as classical theology with its monopolar understanding of God. Moreover, Islamic orthodoxy, in terms of its epistemological and ontological parameters pertaining to the attributes and nature of God, operates within the confines of the divine command theory, also referred to as divine command ethics, that prioritizes the idea of God's sovereignty, will, omnipotence, and transcendence, as they are understood in classical theism, that directly collide with and undermine the ontological primacy of divine relational love as encapsulated in the concept of omnipotence as put forward by Oord. Islamic orthodoxy is also strongly invested in the idea that the Qur'an is the verbatim word of God that has, metaphysically speaking, a meta-human quality to it. This poses a problem to omnipotence because in the Qur'an, God is sometimes described with a number of attributes that conflict with the idea of omnipotence as advocated by Oord. These, for example, include al-Malikul Mulk, which translates to master or sovereign or owner of sovereignty and dominion. God is described as al-Malikul Mulk, the master, sovereign, owner of all sovereignty. Al-Aziz, almighty, and Tom has written extensively on the etymology of the word almighty, which of course poses a problem to open and relational understanding. And Al-Jabbar, all-powerful. So these attributes, if understood through the lens of classical theism, leave no room for omnipotence-based theology in Islam. So for as long as Islamic orthodoxy operates within these, with this described framework, the idea of omnipotence cannot be integrated into the Islamic tradition. However, there is more to the story than this. And if we can please go to the next. Now I would like to spend the rest of this talk looking at the opportunities for integrating omnipotence into the Islamic tradition. So as I said, there are fertile theological grounds for integrating the idea of omnipotence into the Islamic tradition. Now, the first and probably the most important condition that needs to be met is to bring the Quran back to the what I could call the human epistemological plane, and view it as a literary, socio-culturally produced religious discourse or sets of religious discourses that emerged organically in the context of the complex religious milieu of the late antiquity Arabia. Now, there are already a number of contemporary Muslim scholars who have developed such a view of the Quran as revelation, revelation not with a capital R, but with a small r. This would allow for radical re-questioning of the classical theistic monopolar concept of God in Islamic theology and philosophy, and allow for reinterpretation of the omnipotence-related attributes of God that I mentioned earlier, yeah? Such as Al-Jabbar, Al-Aziz, Al-Malik, Al-Mulk. Yeah? So, for example, it could be argued that these earlier mentioned attributes of God that are mentioned in the Quran serve a kind of a literary function to emphasize God's majesty rather than God's omnipotence. Yeah. So we need to kind of revise the concept of revelation and the nature of the Quran as a form of revelation. That needs to be questioned. Now, the second important mechanism that can be used for integrating the idea of omnipotence into the Islamic tradition is to philosophically and ontologically capitalize on Qur'an's frequent reference to God as the most merciful and most compassionate, Ar-Rahman, Ar-Rahim. You might have, coming from you, I'm assuming you're coming from non-Muslim backgrounds, as most of you are, you might have heard of Muslims. Oh, I'm not sure what happened. I touched something. You might have heard of Muslims reciting this formula, Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim, in the name of God, the most merciful, the most compassionate. Some people translate it as the infinitely merciful, infinitely compassionate. And so the Quran frequently uses the attribute of mercy to describe God with the Arabic word rahmah. And the word rahmah is derived from the word rahm, which is associated with a mother's womb, invoking the emotional and physical connotations of a mother's love. So the two terms, Ar-Rahman, the most merciful, and Ar-Rahim, the all-compassionate, are employed in the Quran to express God's mercy. While both terms convey the concept of mercy, they have distinct characteristics. Ar-Rahim, meaning the all-compassionate, is used in the Quran to emphasize God's benevolence and forgiveness, particularly highlighting God's compassionate love, such as in the context of forgiving Adam's sin. Conversely, Ar-Rahman, most merciful, infinitely merciful, signifies God's unconditional love and intention to love people, reflecting the nurturing aspect of God's love. So while compassion, like other attributes of God, is relationally defined, the notion of God being all merciful, Ar-Rahman, is absolute. Yeah? So put differently, mercy is an inherent trait of God, and therefore the attribute Ar-Rahman, or all merciful, encompasses a broader scope than the attribute of Ar-Rahim, which is all compassionate. The next slide, please. I think. Importantly, moreover, the idea of God's all-encompassing mercy and its conceptual primacy in the Quranic framework has scriptural support. In the Quran, chapter 7, verse 156, it's stated, وَرَحْمَتِي وَاسِعَ كُلَّ شَيْءٍ, which can be translated as God referring to herself as, my mercy is all-encompassing. So, and it's basically, it is on a hierarchy of attributes, the the highest. Yeah. So mercy, therefore, flows from the very nature and essence of God, who is defined by profound love and compassion. As the creator of all creation, God's deepest motivation is unconditional love for it. Mercy is how the divine love expresses itself in this world through gracious forgiveness of mistakes and healing of imperfections. The fountainhead of mercy arises from the infinite wellspring of divine love. In essence, according to this approach to Islamic theology, mercy lies at the core of the divine character. It is the most exalted attribute of God, manifesting love and forgiveness toward creation from the boundless depths of the divine care, compassion, and benevolence. In Islamic theology, God's mercy and God's love are therefore intricately connected. Another avenue that presents a fertile ground for omnipotence in Islamic theology can be found in Islamic mysticism. In Islamic mysticism in particular, divine love is considered the highest form of love, a pure, unconditional love that seeks only the beloved's good and feels no self-interest. This form of love is considered as the very nature and essence of God. So in Islamic mysticism, God's eternal love for creation is the cause of divine mercy. Mercy flows from the wellspring of love to pardon faults and lead souls to their beloved. Together, mercy and love are demonstrative of God's utmost compassion for humanity. Therefore, God's all-encompassing love and mercy are not two distinct attributes, but rather two facets of the same divine nature. Where there is divine love, there is mercy, because mercy is the outward expression of inward love. A significant mystic figure whose ideas can be very fruitful in developing the theology of omnipotence in the Islamic tradition is the earlier mentioned Farid ad-Din Attar and his concept of school of love, mazhab-i-ishq. So in my final part of this talk, I turn to his ideas and how they can align with Oord's concept of omnipotence. Next slide, please. So Ibn Attar's school of love and the theology of omnipotence in the Islamic tradition. Attar was a prolific Persian poet and Sufi mystic whose works offer profound insights into Islamic spirituality. He is considered one of the most important poets in Persian literature and arguably one of the two most significant classical Sufi poets alongside Rumi. His impact is particularly pronounced in the Persian, Turkish, and Urdu literature, where his imagery, stories, and style continue to inspire. Attar lived in Nishapur, which is current-day Iran, which at that time was a major center of Islamic learning and spiritual development, which also contributed to the richness of Attar's work. Attar's works are not systematic philosophical treatises, but rather a blend of didactic and homiletic poetry infused with Sufi mystical thought. He employed stories, metaphors, and allegories to convey complex spiritual concepts, making his teachings accessible to a wider audience. A key aspect of Attar's work is his articulation of mazhab-i-ishq, or the school of love, which is a concept that he has developed in his writings. This school of love transcends mere intellectual understanding and emphasizes the transformative power of divine love as the ultimate path to spiritual realization. It is not just a poetic metaphor, but a distinct approach to spirituality that values personal experience over adherence to religious law and doctrine. Attar's understanding of mazhab-i-ishq is profoundly influenced by his engagement with earlier Sufi thinkers, such as Abu Sa'id Ibn Abi al-Khair, and I expect you to know, to remember this name and how to spell it at the end of the talk, and is expressed through symbolic language of love. This school of thought prioritizes the all-consuming power of love over the abilities of the intellect as described by Islamic philosophers. In his view, the intellect is not the most exalted faculty, and the heart and ultimately the spirit are where the true experience of the divine takes place. Attar's Madhhabi Ishq also incorporates the emphasis on devotional sincerity, which aligns with the idea that true devotion to God comes from the heart and is motivated by love rather than fear or social expectations. In this school of love, traditional boundaries of belief are transcended, and the paradox of infidelity to conventional religious practices is embraced as a means of expressing deep love for the divine. And I think we could move on to the next slide. So let us dig a little bit more deeply and try to understand the key characteristics of this Mazhabi Ishq, the school of love. Mazhabi Ishq is not a formal school of thought with specific doctrines, but rather than an umbrella, it's an umbrella term for an ethos or an aesthetic centered on the transformative power of love. It is a way of understanding and relating to God that emphasizes the aesthetic, experiential, and often paradoxical nature of divine love. The key characteristics of the school of love as expressed by Attar include love as the ultimate path. Love is presented as surpassing all other ways of knowing and serving God. It is seen as the most direct route to union with the divine. Rejection of rigid adherence to norms. The school of love prioritizes sincere devotion over ritualistic or legalistic observance. It values the spirit of love over the letter of the law, often challenging conventional piety. Another key characteristic is the paradox of infidelity. Attar uses the word infidelity or kufr, which in Islamic theology has kind of very negative. You might have heard the word kafir or kufr. And that's why I have included that quote at the beginning of the talk where Attar says that he has once you discover the divine love, you abandon both Islam as well as infidelity. Yeah. So Attar uses the word infidelity metaphorically to describe the unconventional and sometimes transgressive expressions of love that arise when one is completely consumed by the divine. These expressions are actually contrary to orthodox Islamic beliefs, but they signify the lover's total absorption in the beloved. Another key characteristic is this emphasis on experience over reason in Mazhabi Ishq. The school of love prioritizes the experiential and intuitive understanding of God over rational or intellectual discourse. Love in this context is a force that transcends the intellect. Finally, the final characteristic, and perhaps most important for the purposes of this talk, is the idea that love is the primordial cosmological force. Attar, maybe we need the next slide. Attar describes love as a fundamental force, even greater than the universe itself. The world and everything in it is a shadow of the sun of love. Now that we are familiar with some of the key characteristics of Mazhabi Ishq, let's look at potential avenues of integrating it with the concept of omnipotence as conceptualized and discussed by Tom. So several elements of Mazhabi Ishq uniquely are suited to developing a theology of love in Islam based on the concept of omnipotence. Number one, love, the idea of love as the essence of reality. In Mazhabi Ishq, love or Ishq is not just an attribute of God, but is the very essence of God, the very basis of existence itself. This is a fundamental departure from classical theology that prioritizes God's will or God's power. Attar often depicts the entire cosmos as a manifestation of divine love, emphasizing that all beings are drawn to God through love. This cosmic vision of love resonates with the idea of an omnipotent God whose power is expressed through the relentless and enduring force of love that sustains all of creation, as discussed by Oord. Number 2, emphasis on personal experience. The school of love values the direct experience of divine love over adherence to religious law or doctrine. This experiential emphasis opens the door for diverse and personal interpretations of faith, moving away from a monolithic, transcendent concept of God as anchored in classical theism. This emphasis on personal experience aligns with an omnipotent view of God, which recognizes the unique, deeply relational relationship between the divine and in the human individual. Love as the supreme attribute. Amipotence, like Madhhabi Ishq, positions love as the supreme attribute of God. This is a significant shift from approaches that highlight God's power of judgment. It suggests that the purpose of creation is to foster relationships of love, not to impose obedience or command. This idea is rooted in the Sufi tradition that love is not just a way to God, but that love is the very nature and essence of God. Which brings me to the next point, God as a lover, not as a ruler. Attar's school of love posits that God's relationship with creation is not that of a sovereign to subjects, but rather that of a lover to the beloved. This is a departure from the classical theistic concept of God as a transcendent and all-powerful ruler. Instead, Attar envisions a God who is deeply invested in a reciprocal relationship with her, creation, a relationship characterized by love, compassion, and mercy. This love is not a detached or impersonal force, but a passionate, all-consuming energy that pervades all of existence. In this view, the universe is a manifestation of God's love, and all of creation reflects this divine love. This idea of God as a lover is also supported by the Qur'an, which I mentioned earlier, frequently uses the attribute of mercy to describe God's nature. Divine love that respects free will. Attar's understanding of divine love is one that respects free will. God does not force love upon creation, but rather allows beings to freely choose to engage in a relationship of love with the divine. This concept is significant because it highlights the importance of individual agency in the spiritual journey. God's invitation to love is an offer that must be freely accepted. This free choice is essential for the experience of love to be genuine. Love cannot exist without freedom, which allows for a real relationship to exist between the lover and the beloved. The idea of free will also aligns with the notion that love must be reciprocal. Oord, in his writing, refers to it as the uncontrolling love of God, which is also part of his definition of omnipotence that I have provided you with earlier in the talk. The ethical implications of divine love. The divine love that Attar advocates, like that of the idea of omnipotence in God's theology, has significant ethical implications. This love must inspire empathy, compassion, and justice in the world. Attar's view of love challenges the notion that religion should be limited to a set of rituals or dogmas. Instead, he posits that true devotion is expressed through acts of love and kindness towards others. The concept of mercy is also central to Attar's ethical framework. As God is the source of infinite mercy, those who seek to embody divine love must also exhibit compassion and forgiveness. This is why many of Attar's stories focus on the actions and teachings of saints and other figures who embody love and selflessness in their action. Attar's work encourages individuals to move beyond self-centeredness and to love God and others selflessly. This ethic of love extends beyond the human realm to all of creation. So to conclude, the journey towards integrating omnipotence into Islamic tradition presents both significant challenges and promising opportunities. By re-examining the Quran as a socio-cultural discourse and emphasizing the attributes of mercy and compassion as ontologically most primordial, Islamic theology of love can move beyond the confines of classical theism as internalized in Islamic orthodoxy. The teachings of Attar and the concept of madhhabi ishq, the school of love, like that of Oord's omnipotence, invite us to embrace a view of God that is not based on the idea of a sovereign ruler, but a loving and compassionate presence in our lives and a primordial force of love permeating reality. This transformative theology, moreover, encourages us to cultivate relationships grounded in love and empathy, allowing divine mercy to flow through our interactions with one another and with the world. As we reflect on these insights, let us remain open to the profound implications of divine love that respect our free will, inspire ethical living, and ultimately bring us closer to the essence of our faith, which is simply love. Thank you so much for listening, and look forward to our discussion.
Thank you, Otis. Thank you so much for a wealth of information and for introducing us both to a little bit to Tom's work, but also to this thinker in or mystic in the Islamic tradition that I was unfamiliar with. So that's really good to hear about him. So was he, now you said was he after Rumi or before Rumi?
He was before Rumi, and there
Okay.
is evidence suggesting that Rumi actually was inspired by him.
Okay. Wow.
Yes.
Wonderful. And do are there collections of his poetry translated into English that are
Well,
available?
most definitely, yes, most
Yeah.
definitely.
Okay.
His most important work. Recently, a colleague actually published an amazing book, Religion of Love, which
Uh-huh.
focuses on Fariduddin Attar's writings,
Oh.
published in 2024. Yeah, it's called The Religion of Love. I can provide a link maybe to the book. It's probably
Hmm.
the best work of scholarship on Attar's work. But you can also recently I came across some YouTube videos that have his poetry. So you can, if you don't have access to like scholarly writings on him, there's
Hmm.
some interesting stuff on Ibn Attar and his major work, The Conference of the Birds. That's his major work, which is
Huh.
kind of a mystical journey. He uses metaphor of birds, like people, they're looking for this god bird, and they go on this treacherous journey, challenging journey, and then like only a few of them make it, and then when they meet this god bird, they realize that that's the god within themselves, and
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
learn this truth that there is a divine spark in all of us, and
Yeah.
yeah. So
Great, great. Yeah, isn't in the Sufi tradition specifically, isn't there a really strong emphasis on the heart?
most definitely, yeah, the qalb, yeah, like in other traditions, really Eastern traditions, the mind and the heart is kind of they use the word is that they use is actually the heart, yeah.
Right,
So there's
right.
a lot of emphasis on the heart, yeah,
Yeah.
as
Yeah.
as the main avenue through which we approach the divine, yeah.
Right, right. Good, wonderful. Well, let's open it up to questions. If you want to ask a question or make a comment, if you easiest would be if you could raise your virtual hand. If you go to the menu in Zoom and go to the reactions uh, menu item and then click on that, you can see where you can raise your hand. So, Tom, why don't you start us off?
Great, thank you. What a great presentation. Man, I loved it as I was like, I've got a ton of notes right here. I'm writing furiously as you're talking. I love all the connections you see and the issues that you raise. Um, I was thinking of, well, let me preface this by saying the last time I really studied the Quran was 30 years ago in grad school. So I was not like fresh in my mind. So I was really keen to see how you would, address issues of the Quran, and also my sense that just like many Christians have been influenced by Neoplatonic thought and classical theism, I knew that many Muslims had as well. So I was kind of thinking, okay, I wonder what strategies Addis is going to point to make the kind of connection between amipotence and Islamic thought. And so the one strategy was, okay, look at the Quran and say it developed in a particular time and place, socio-historical context, and in that way, perhaps say something like we're in a different context and we have different, ways of thinking. So that's one approach. Another one was, at least as I understood it, you can correct me if I'm wrong. Another one was something like taking love as God's ontological priority, and sort of moving from that direction. And then the third one that I picked up was something like begin with this deep piety and this experience of love, and say that that in some way can overcome any sort of intellectual obstacles given to it by classical theologians, etc. And in my Christian tradition, those are the same kind of strategies that people use as well to deal with either scripture or classical theism. But there's one other strategy that came to my mind, and this is my question for you. I wonder if this appears in your work or in Islam somewhere. And it's a strategy I've been thinking a lot about lately because I'm writing a systematic theology of love. And because of that, I'm looking at some Christian scriptures related to what it says about God. And one of my strategies is to say the Christian scriptures themselves are not consistent. So sometimes God is said to be everywhere. Other passages say God is absent from some places. Sometimes God is said to be an incorporeal universal spirit. Other times God has a body walking around. It's kind of things. There's lots of this, well, in the Christian scriptures. And so one of my strategies is to say, well, if you're going to have a coherent theology, you got to pick, and I'm picking this one or that one or whatever. Is that something that Muslim scholars can do, or is the cost too high to say, the Quran is right here, but it's wrong here?
All right. Well, thanks for the question, Tom. And thanks. I was a little bit worried that my connections between Amipotence and School of Ishq might be not well grounded in my understanding of Amipotence, but I'm glad you've expressed agreement and alignment. So that's always pleasing. Yeah. Look, I think the same kind of reservations like apply to the Quran. The kind of inconsistencies that you refer to, like the Quran also, for example, if we use the question of corporeality of God, Quran sometimes talks about God in very abstract terms, but then in a few passages it talks about God descending from heaven or having a right hand or so. I think and then you can also, like, on the question of free will and determinism, there's some Quranic verses suggest that every soul is responsible for all its actions. There's free will agency. The other ones, emphasize God's ability to lead people away, from the straight path, So definitely, I mean, I guess if there is one advantage the Quran has over the Bible, or at least some parts of the Bible, the Quran, even within the tradition, it is recognized as a kind of a set of discourses. It's the kind of the oral nature of the scripture, the kind of its more didactic set of discourses, and therefore there is no expectation for it to be like a coherent, systematic exploration of theology. Yeah. So that's perhaps one way, this dialogical nature of the Quran. Even the most orthodox, adherent to the Islamic tradition cannot deny that the Quran is very dialogical and discursive. So, and we also in the Islamic tradition we have something called like a Quranic discipline, occasions behind revelation. So there is like this extra Quranic literature that talks about, which has problems of its own, but at least it kind of points to this idea that certain Quranic verses had specific occasions. There were specific reasons why they were promulgated, why they emerged. I don't want to use the word revealed, or revealed with a small r. Yeah. So, and there is kind of there's no expectation to consider the Quran as a systematic theological treatise. And also in the Islamic tradition, there's something called the abrogation theory that tries to reconcile contradictory Quranic verses, saying that these verses have been kind of abrogated or are no longer by God, abrogated by God.
Okay. Interesting.
So, and therefore, it's very much an interpreter's choice. And that's why in my writings, I have always, like, my PhD was all about how one's chosen interpretational methodology framework dictates very significantly the interpretational outcomes of these texts. So I mean, and I think everybody is on the level playing ground. Even our critics who adhere to more orthodox interpretations of our faiths cannot really say that they have a presuppositionless approach, or they don't operate within a particular interpretational framework. So this pick and choose, is inevitable to some extent, and it just kind of reiterates the importance of a systematic kind of methodology and systematic theology. And I'm glad you are embarking upon this project. I think it's essential to approach scripture from a kind of systematic, not just theology, but philosophy and metaphysics. And then, so I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, it does. And I didn't realize there was as much flexibility available to the Muslim biblical interpreter as you're portraying. So that's good. I mean, theoretically, there's that same flexibility in Christianity, and but just the more conservative and fundamentalist ends of Christianity don't see it that way. But that's encouraging to me. So thanks, Addis.
Who else has a question or comment? Yeah, Jason.
Yes, I was wondering, I'm sorry, am I coming through?
Yes, go ahead.
Yeah. I just was wondering, earlier in your presentation, you mentioned emphasizing the majesty of God over God's power. Could you tell us a little more about how you're defining God's majesty? Is there a difference between, say, God's majesty and God's sovereignty?
So, that's an excellent question. And I can't say that I've given it a lot of thought, but let me give it a go. So traditionally speaking, especially in Islamic, Islamic spirituality, I guess even theology, God's attributes are divided into those pertaining to majesty, Jalal. So one of the attributes of God is Jalal. And if you look at Rumi's name, Jalaluddin al-Rumi, right? So even his name has this majesty of faith. His name refers to this attribute of God, Jalal. And the other sets of attributes are Jamali, or attributes of beauty. So mercy and Ar-Rahman Ar-Rahim, they would fall into the ones that I mentioned in my talk. Mercy and compassion, they would fall into these Jamali, the attributes of beauty. So majesty, in my view, is more about this concept of awe and reverence, which does not necessarily translate into this concept of, classically, the concept of omnipotence as understood in classical theism. So it's more about that numinous, the awe and the reverence that one sometimes experiences in the presence of the divine. It's kind of more an expression of that. Yeah. The awesomeness of power, but not the unilateral power of God as espoused in classical theism.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you.
Bhavana posted in the chat, she said, recently I observed an Islamic Family Therapy Institute in Singapore ran a 2-day program on mercy. The participants reflected on Allah's mercy in events in life to embody that mercy in family issues. They even ran a warm data lab on mercy in a changing world to elicit trans-contextual stories on mercy. It seemed to have connected quite a bit because I saw a number of testimonials on this.
Yeah, I mean, the idea of mercy is really quite strongly entrenched in the Islamic tradition. So even like sermons, if you go and listen to sermons in mosques, often they would be about mercy. There's a famous hadith or story reportedly attributed to Muhammad talking about, that God's mercy to humans is 70 times more powerful than the love of mother for her child. And from a critical historical perspective, this actually comes from the Orthodox Christian, the concept of mercy in Orthodox Christianity. The Syrian church fathers have emphasized this concept of mercy in Orthodox Christianity, and this was picked up and kind of transfused into the Islamic tradition. Yeah, so definitely, this concept of mercy for more Orthodox kind of people, for Muslims who don't see themselves as Sufis or mystics, or kind of and got kind of a little bit wary of its kind of transgressions that I just explained, they would kind of use this concept of mercy as a lens through which they view the divine. But of course, they do not question the mainstream Islamic theology within which this concept of mercy is kind of couched and interpreted.
Yeah, that you're talking about mercy and compassion in the tradition reminds me a little bit of hearing Richard Rohr say that it's not that God forgives every now and then, but that God's permanent stance toward reality is forgiveness. And I just really love that emphasis on mercy and compassion there.
Yeah.
Tom put in the chat, the Quran's emphasis upon God as compassionate seems to be a strong criticism of classical theism's emphasis upon impassibility. Compassion requires a God who feels. Is this something discussed by Muslim scholars?
Wow, that's an excellent point, Tom, which I'm going to integrate into my when I write this up again. Yeah, look, the connection between compassion and possible, like the or potentially tensions between impassibility as one of the pillars of classical theistic concept of God definitely contradicts the idea, the attribute of compassion. So it's definitely, I think, another fertile a theological snippet, or kind of we could use to question, to question the God of classical theism. So thank you for bringing that up.
Yeah, and just
Now so I
was going to say the
haven't really.
impassibility is referring to the belief that God is not affected by the world, doesn't feel what the world does, or isn't affected by the world.
Yeah, and again, Islamic Sufism, given its emphasis on the relationship between the divine and the human as one between the lover and the beloved, again underscores this idea that a God cannot be impassible.
Right.
If in that kind of relationship, impassibility just doesn't make any sense.
No.
Yeah. So another excellent point by Tom, of course.
Anyone else? We've got a few more minutes. We could probably take at least one more question. Oh, Aiza put in the chat, mainstream Islamic theology emphasizes Quran as a literal word of God. Are there modern approaches that challenge this? I find in progressive circles, people do believe in this still. I am reading a book on Hafiz and his Madhab Ishq. I am not sure if he had that view, either based on my own readings of some of his poems, but curious to know more.
Yeah, excellent point. Thank you for that. Hafiz is another Iranian Persian. He's probably even more popular in contemporary Iran at a kind of a let's say ordinary believer kind of understanding. Not so much maybe, but even in seminaries in Iran, I guess he's still. I do not have an intimate understanding what's going on in seminaries in Iran. But yeah, Hafez is another one who belongs to the same kind of school of love. Yeah, but they were not like Attar. I think Attar, his profession was his last name suggests that he was a pharmacist. So they were not kind of seminary theologians. Yeah, they were more kind of poet philosophers, like sages, wise people. So, and they influence while it kind of disseminated was primarily through like at the level of ordinary believers rather than systematic theology or kind of seminary kind of thinking. So that was going on separately. Yeah. So and that's why they probably didn't feel qualified to engage with these debates about the nature of the Quran. But in the contemporary context, I know of at least 4 Muslim scholars, contemporary Muslim scholars, who have definitely tried to at least dilute, if not radically question, this concept of Quran as being a verbatim word of God. One of them was the late Professor Fazlur Rahman, who died in 1988. And he basically said, basically tried to say that Quran is both a divine and a human word. I've actually have a chapter on this coming out soon. He tried to emphasize that this idea that the Quran is not just that Muhammad was not just a loudspeaker through which like this empty vessel through which God spoke, but that his psychological, spiritual makeup or conditioning was intimately kind of involved in this channeling of the divine. So Fazlur Rahman is one of them. The late Professor Nasser Abu Zaid from Cairo University, who was a philosopher who wrote extensively on the Quran from a Quran as a literary kind of text, also has developed a very systematic understanding of the concept of revelation, like at multiple levels, and the Quran as a text does not correspond to the same divine communication that has a metaphysical quality. So Abu Zaid is another one. There's an Iranian scholar by the name of Shabestari, who is even more radical and basically says Quran is a product of Muhammad's spiritual worldview. So we have, Abdul Karim Surush, another Iranian, also has emphasized the contingent and historical nature of revelation and inspiration in Islam, and he connects it to the Sufi tradition. So yeah, you're right that even like within some progressive circles, I'm a kind of a radical progressive in that sense because I accept the metaphysical criticism of process relational metaphysics and I apply it to the Quran. But progressive Muslims who do not have a strong, I guess, background in metaphysics and kind of philosophy of religion, they are still, I guess, they apply this contextualist lens, but only in relation to Islamic law and ethics, but perhaps still adhere to Islamic Orthodox concept of revelation. So yeah, but there are so Shabestari. I'm going to put it in the chat. Soroush. There's a wonderful book by someone called Ali Akbar, who has written on this.
That one just went to me, Otis. Looks like you'll have to
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
All right. Sorry. Yeah, it does say direct message. So
yeah.
That person is welcome to contact me.
I put the two that you sent me in the chat to everyone. So.
Oh, lovely. Yeah. So you
want to put your an email address in the chat that people can reach out to you?
Yep.
Very good.
Yeah. Yeah. So in the Islam, the Sufis have used the word inspiration to kind of say that, revelation does continue even after Muhammad. But they didn't want to use the technical term for revelation in Islamic theology because they would be accused of being heretics, which could have potentially deadly consequences.
Yeah.
So yeah, they use that alternative word ilham as inspiration. That ilham continues after Muhammad, and that the Sufi masters are the inheritors of this inspiration. Yeah.
Wonderful. Yeah, I know that there has been criticism of some of the English translations of Rumi and Hafiz by Coleman Barks and others. There's been critique of their translations, but I just know that when I read them, they make me so happy. Those poets, those mystical poets, just make me so happy when I read them. So I really appreciate it.
However, they were not immune. It's interesting. I had a discussion with an expert on Rumi, Professor Mahdi Touraj. He's based at one of the universities in Canada, who has done a lot of work on Rumi. So unfortunately, despite all his very uplifting spiritual kind of poetry, he had some highly problematic views on women and even of people who were not Muslims. So he was not immune to the cultural conditioning. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I guess we could say that about so many important figures who gave us beautiful work, but in their own lives or because of their own cultures were more complex than we'd like them to be, and as flawed as the rest of us. So,
and that's one of the reasons why I didn't want to focus on Rumi today, because I haven't. Ibn Attar, I'm not aware of him having any of these additional problematic views that I knew Rumi does have. So.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Otis. Let's all give Otis a wonderful round of applause and good response. That was really very informative, and thank you for bringing this to us. Otis, we really appreciate your being here with us tonight.
A pleasure. I feel I'm really amongst friends, and theologically speaking, but generally speaking, I love to be immersed with the process and community, and I'm grateful to be able to call myself someone who belongs to this community. I do feel that I do belong, so thank you.
Absolutely, absolutely. We do appreciate you and value your work, and thank you. Before I let you all go, I just wanted to say I put a link in the chat. Next week on Wednesday, Jay McDaniel will begin teaching in partnership between Process and Faith and the Interfaith Center of Arkansas. Jay will teach a course on exploring ideas in the world's religions, where he'll be using Process, Thought, and Houston Smith in dialogue to look at the world's religions. So if that kind of thing, that kind of exploration, it's 8 sessions, so it's a full course. If that interests you, please check that out. And like I said, go to our website and subscribe to receive our newsletter if you're not already on our list, and you'll hear about other things we have coming up. So again, thank you, Otis, and thank you all for being here. We're so grateful that you joined us, and we hope to see you again.